So we have a program called Jamestown's Latest: Archaeology and Relevance of Church and State in Virginia's First General Assembly.
Good afternoon, everyone. I just want to introduce David Givens, Director of Archaeology at the Jamestown Rediscovery, and let him share with you what they have done to date over the last 400 plus years. And he's also going to introduce today some new and hopefully exciting news for all of you. So David, thank you on behalf of Encore Learning for taking the time to join us. And I know everyone will appreciate the info that you're going to provide.
Okay, well, thank you, Madeline, and thank you for having me. This is a pretty exciting time. We're doing a lot of work here at the Rediscovery Program. And for those of you guys who may not be familiar with the Rediscovery Program, we are it's been a quarter of a century of excavation, which I've had the pleasure to have experienced most of that. And we are a small nonprofit on the western end of Jamestown Island. And the Park Service, the National Park Service, surrounds us. And we co-manage the island. There's a visitor center and parking lot. And then you walk out to the original site, which you can see here in the picture. It's our the triangular fort, which is on the riverside there, the cafe and museum, and our offices in the background. So pretty small place, very humble, but from very humble things come great stories, which is an American story for us. Now, I was explaining to David Tate, there's a Jamestown next door, the Jamestown settlement, and that is not the original site. And in fact, we're only associated in some of the academic ways. But we are the real place. We have the real things. And today you're speaking with the real person, or you're going to listen, I guess, to the real person. And then hopefully we'll have good questions afterwards. Now, one of the things that I like to talk about is what historical archaeology is. And I've been doing a lot of work with the Max Planck lab in Germany and up at Harvard. Dr. Turi King at Leicester University and David Reich at Harvard to do ancient DNA work on our collection. And not a lot of people know who Max Planck was. He was a physicist in the 1920s. And once he won the Nobel Prize, he decided he was going to have a driver and a chauffeur. And folks like Einstein would come to his lectures, and he pretty big guy, big deal. And after several lectures, his chauffeur said, "I think I can give your lecture." And so Max Planck, being a bit of a joker, switched clothes with his chauffeur. And at the lectures, the chauffeurs would sit in the back. And so Max Planck sat at the back up against the wall. And the chauffeur, in true form, gave the lecture. And at the end, the audience started to ask questions. And the chauffeur said, "Well, listen, I'm disappointed in that you guys as an audience, your questions are so easy, even my chauffeur could answer them." And the moral of the story is that we live Jamestown and the history and the archaeology that's here. And I would wager a fair amount that the information that the team has garnered after 26 years of digging is unparalleled. And so the talk today is from the horse's mouth. And I want to talk firstly about what archaeology is, and some of the challenges, and then certainly what we're waist deep in right now. And I always like to do that. I always put in slides of what we're working on as of last week and some of the things we found. So I'm originally grew up in Blacksburg, Virginia, and worked for the electrical engineering department there as a student, building computers. And I carried that into archaeology, and that I'm a geographic information specialist, firstly, digital modeler. Where the team here, some of us are a bit geeky in terms of you don't often meet archaeologists that embrace technology and computer science. But I see the world in a Cartesian sense, and that everything that we're doing is a gridded out, an invisible grid, and that all data from any time period has the criteria of time, space, and form. And any crime scene data today, and I've taught police classes to police in which we talk about this, and they say, wow, we live it, but we've never heard that before, that all data has time, space, and form. And in fact, arguably, you could switch that up as a polynomial equation and define space through time plus form, for example. But I see archaeology, historical archaeology, is on a graph. So firstly, archaeology is metonymic. And what I mean by that is that we work in terms of a linear sense of time. So I'm just going to use this as an example because there's certainly predicates to Jamestown, but the time here for the English started in 1607, 1608, et cetera, et cetera. And so time marches onward, and the things in space and time change over time, right? So you guys would understand 1957 Chevy versus 2007 Chevy. Those are artifacts that you experience, but that's essentially what we're talking about. It's empirical, and the artifacts, we don't argue about their existence, we argue about why they're there and what space they're taking up and things like that. So oftentimes people will be aghast when we find a broken sort of piece of ceramic and we get all excited. This is a German stoneware panel jug from the site of First Africans, and in the background are reporters who are filming me, and I was just absolutely just overjoyed to find that. And it's because the lion that was on the jug is allegorical to King James, the sun that would light up the world. And so our world is fractured often, and it's by understanding the whole of what we have is often confusing to people, but it's what we aim to do. We aim to take the fractured and put it back together, and that's often hard. So if you look at a modern day football game, there's 4 referees and they're all staring at the same play, and they still have to go to a TV to watch the play, right? And we're trying to figure out what went on 400 years ago. It's challenging, right? Another aspect of archaeology and what we're experiencing is that oftentimes the evidence of, or oftentimes the absence of evidence can speak a lot. Now, these are bear tracks, right? When I put these into a lecture a couple of years ago, I didn't realize that people don't know what bear tracks are, right? Growing up in the mountains, I thought everybody knew what those are, but these are bear tracks. And by the absence of the individual, the bear, the animal, you can garner some bit of information as this animal passed through the area. And that's often what we're dealing with. Now, history is metaphorical. And what I mean by that is that you cannot take reality and put it on paper. And in fact, one of my professors of historical archaeology, Dr. Jim Deach, once wrote that history is written by rich, white, educated males. And I'm paraphrasing. And I was taken aback by that. So that's a crazy statement, but it's true. The people who wrote about Jamestown were educated Englishmen, and from their perspective, a lot gets left out in some. Children, women, First Peoples, First Africans. And so the perspective of the past, the 400-year-old perspective, is often seen from atop. And this is an analogous to this structure here. The Eiffel Tower was constructed in Paris, and at the time, people were just absolutely hated it. But the idea was that you would look from the top and look down on the order from above down below. And the famous artist Guy de Maupassant said the only time he could suffer the tower was when he was eating lunch at the top, so he didn't have to look at it. And the cautionary tale is that history is often somewhat contentious. And I would say that Jamestown has always been that way. And so we aspire to reconcile both the archaeology and the history and every way that it is, and interpret the past through the lens of today, right? So we study the past. We don't live in it, essentially. So on that note, let's talk first about history, because history and archaeology are inevitably linked together. But if you're not familiar with Jamestown's history, I'm not going to give a hour-long lecture about the history because it's very easy to do. But it's our nation's first corporation. The Virginia Company sets up a corporate venture that's a stock holding company. It would have cost around $3,500 in today's money to buy a share of stock. And the company was set up 3 years after Queen Elizabeth's death, and King James I allowed this company to start and have stockholders. And they left London in 1606, which not a lot of people know, and came over to the New World with explicit directions on what to do. So we know quite a bit about why they settled at Jamestown in 1607, in May of 1607. And it's based on directions of not having any Indians between you and the ocean and settling in a low area. And in fact, one of the only icons we have of our fort is from John Smith, and it was stolen by a Spanish courtesan, a gentleman named Pedro de Zuniga, and was deposited in the archives in Salamanca, only to be found in the last century and published. But it is the only icon that we have. The sort of X marks the spot in the center, we now know is the 1608 church. And because he was Spanish, he's drawing a Maltese cross, which is very common for Spanish maps, a Maltese cross on a mound. The flag to the top, we may have found that with ground penetrating radar, and I will have to come back and talk to you guys about that when we dig it up and find it. But very interesting feature there. And then currently we're working down here where the water has essentially eroded away on the eastern end of the fort. So north is to the top. And that's also something that I'll have to come back and chat with you about. Now, despite what you've heard or maybe read in documents, Jamestown did survive. John Rolfe, who had been shipwrecked on Bermuda, acquired Spanish tobacco seeds. So not a lot of people know there's two types of tobacco: Virginia native tobacco and essentially the longleaf or Orinoco. It's generally known as the Orinoco brand, which is a Mayan plant that was grown in the Caribbean. The Spanish encountered it and then started planting it on every island they encountered, and also deposited pigs. And John Rolfe and the folks who were shipwrecked there during the starving time winter of 69 and 10 acquired seeds. He brought them to Jamestown, planted them, and that was our #1 export from 1613 to 2005. That's a pretty big deal there, and that grew a nation. Now, during the starving time winter, the colonists attacked the Indians to get food, and that started a war which did not end until John Rolfe, a year later, after he grows tobacco and exports it. In 1614, he marries Pocahontas, and that ends the Anglo-Powhatan War, and James Fort grows into Jamestown, which is our colonial capital until 1699, when it's removed off the island to what today is Colonial Williamsburg, but back then was called Middle Plantation. And when you take a capital off an island, it basically fades into history. And that's where our story begins, with this church tower. This is our iconic tower that's out on the island. It stood as a lone 17th century edifice, and you can see it's amongst some trees. Well, in the 1890s, early 1890s, people complained that there were human remains eroding out of the earthworks, the Civil War earthworks that were here, the shoreline, essentially, into the river. People complained, and a group of preservationists came out from Williamsburg, particularly this woman, Mary Jeffrey Galt, Mary Winder Garrett, and Confederate stonemason William Leal came out to the island and essentially petitioned and acquired 22.5 acres of the island and began excavations in 1897. So in 1893, they got the property. In 1897, Mary Jeffrey Galt said, "With my own hands, we excavated the building of the first representative government in English North America, a 1617 timber frame church." So if you're not familiar with Jamestown, we have multiple churches over time. The first church is a sailcloth and tent outside the fort. The second is a timber frame church where the X marks the spot was in the Zuniga map. That's a 1608 church. It begins to decay and they build a new timber frame church on brick and cobblestone foundations in 1617. And that church is where representative government is held in 1619. And of course, you guys know 2019 was a couple of years ago, and was the 400th anniversary of the first representative government in English North America. And the gentleman in the middle is Sir George Yardley, the presiding governor and knight of that first General Assembly, and also one of the owners of 8 of the first Africans that arrived a few weeks after this governmental body held court in the 1617 church. So in anticipation of the commemorative year, we decided to go back and re-excavate what had been done at the turn of the century. So we had 2 aims. One was to define a sense of place for Americans and curious visitors from around the world where this democracy was held, and also look at some of the remains. So I did want to say that I will be showing human remains in the video, and I hope it's not upsetting, but it's something that I always warn people about. But humans are artifacts, and we have to honor them and understand a lot of the people we're studying were lost to the past and not understood. So it's an honor for us to bring their stories essentially back to life. Now, the scary thing is in this picture up where the log is crossing the foundation and the shovel is leaning against the log, that's human remains exposed there. I know it's hard to see, but the problem is when you expose bones or human remains to oxygen, they quickly decay. And we found this in other areas around Jamestown on our site. And so that was one of the goals, is to go back and look at those remains. Now, in the picture, you see the log and a board crossing foundations. What that is there's rather large brick foundations. And in 1639, they built a second church around the timber frame church, keeping it whole. So the 2 churches existed, one inside the other, one sticking out for quite a while. And then in 1647, they enclosed the brick church completely, leaving a wooden bell tower out front, leaving 10 by 20 feet of that original timber frame. And then that timber frame portion is what's burned in Bacon's Rebellion in 1676. So very complicated, but we wanted to get in there and define those areas to commemorate the space and learn more about both the buildings and the people. So that's what we're going to talk about straight away. So this is what the church looked like in 2016 before we started. You guys, if you've been out visiting Jamestown, you probably remember this. There's a chancel. So the holiest part of a church is the eastern end. The white squares mark burials they found at the turn of the century. And then, of course, we had windows defining the foundation. So very quickly, we stripped up the floor. And much to our surprise, it was very intact. There's center aisle there. The question I get a lot is, what is that brick thing going across the church? That's actually a cemetery wall that was built in 1803 to enclose the graveyard. And the church, the brick church was gone. It was just a pile of bricks. Only the tower stood. And so they used those bricks to build a cemetery wall. And then the brick church you see standing over it was built in 1906 in anticipation of the 300th anniversary of America's birthplace. And we call that the Memorial Church. And it actually preserved the archaeology probably largely underneath. But this is what we were looking at. You see the trench in the far eastern end, which is, so the top of the slide was the excavation trenches where they dug into burials. So again, we're going to talk about both of those. So right away, we were looking for that 17 church foundation inside the original, the 1639 brick, and we quickly found it. It was very compacted clay with cobblestones and brick on top of that, 2 rows of brick. And this is simply adaptation and change. One of the things the New World had that they don't have in England, not a lot of people realize this, is termites. And so if you have logs that are in ground contact, where they're damp all the time, despite what you might want to do, the termites get into them. And so this is their attempt. This is adaptation change from earlier structures in which they were having problems with that. Now, very quickly, we were able to define the eastern wall, which is shown here on the far end in yellow, a couple pieces. Now you'll see they're segmented by burials. Those are burial shafts. There are a multitude of burial shafts that cut through that. But there was enough there that we could find the eastern wall, and then that defined where the western wall would be. And the reason for that is because they described the church in detail. Now they said, and this is where we match the empirical evidence to historic document, they said the church was 20 by 50. Okay, so once you get the eastern end, you got the 20 in the north and south. The eastern end put us right in the middle of our church tower. Now I had left the church tower alone because I figured somebody had dug inside the church tower. And in fact, the brickwork that was in the middle of the tower, and you can see a drain there, was put in 1976 for the bicentennial. They sort of gussied up the site a little bit on the inside of the church and the tower, and a brick path out front. So I left little excitement about digging inside there. But once we found the eastern end and could define that, we came back and wanted to take a look. Now, for us recently, we have been implementing ground penetrating radar. So this unit that this gentleman is pushing across the ground here is a 350 megahertz unit, and it's pumping essentially low frequency radio waves into the ground, almost like a digital knife. And then what we do is we take the lines that we survey, and we put those together into an interpolation or map. And when we did that back in the lab, we about fell out of our chairs because this dark stain here was too good to be true. First of all, it was exactly 50 feet from the eastern end, but it was so clear, exceptionally clear. The dark spot to the west is actually just the drain, the metal drain that was there, and everything else showed up exceptionally clearly. So we very quickly and gently removed the brick, and we found the same brick and mortar and cobblestone wall that was around the rest of the church. Now, the darker material on both sides is the evidence from Bacon's Rebellion. The caramel colored material around the outside is the builder's trench for the tower. And you can see that the tower fill is actually cutting the burning layer. And so axiomatically, that means that the tower comes after the burning in Bacon's Rebellion. And this is quite upsetting to a lot of folks because they wanted to think that the tower was much earlier in the 17th century, but it could not be. And archaeology is very much like police work. So once we had our 4 bounds of the church, our 20 by 50 church, we could then define locations within it. And one of the ones that we really wanted to find was what they called the choir, and they spelled it with a Q. And the reason that we wanted to find the choir is that in the John Pori, the secretary of the colony, wrote that the burgesses took their oath of office in the choir and then receded to the body of the church to conduct government. And we know from the descriptions that this holiest of places in the eastern end was where the burgesses and the governor sat. And so once we had defined that, the building is 20 by 50, almost all Protestant churches, actually all the ones we found in England and researched, 33 1/3 of the church, and this is asterism, 33 1/3 of the church is the choir. And so that's simply putting a location or a sense of place with historic documents. And so you guys will see more later what we've done. So we turned our focus to the building. And again, the majority of what we do is trying to envision these lost places, right? So we're dealing with something that's melted into the ground and we want to build it back up. And it's actually a very interesting process. And I love this picture. I stuck it in there because we're all sort of looking quizzically at what we call fabrics of the churches, different churches. And what fabrics are today is simply the walls, right? What the walls are, which is plaster, brown coats, infill from infill of clay and things like that. Some plasters are I'll refer to from this point out as rendering. So the English would call it rendering. They would render a wall. Today you just put up drywall, right? Insulation and drywall. Back then they used clay and then a sort of a brown coat, a sandy mortar, and then a render. So that's what we ended up looking through to get our forensic evidence of what the building looked like. And this is what we found. So when I was in graduate school in England and we had a vernacular architecture class, they said, well, this is one of the rarest types. It's defined as early 17th century and you'll never see this. Well, of course, we're early 17th century, so my ears peaked up, but it's exactly what we found. And what it is they have their timber, main timbers, which are structural, and then in between those, they have what they call studs. So of course, you guys know we use stud construction today, but in between the studs, they would slide lath, split lath and slide it down the studs so that it would stack like an accordion. And when they put the mud or the brown coat on, we would end up seeing that in reverse. So you see the picture at the top is a gentleman in Kentucky who's practicing what we found. The outside was rendered and waterproofed, and the mud on the back of that, they would take a dowel or their finger and then press that into the mud. And you see the piece I'm holding is actually has those dimples in reverse, and the piece at the bottom is on the interior, it's the brown coat up against the lath. The mud walls just probably melted into history, although you can see it a little bit on the back of that piece there. Now, of course, we don't just study things in a gross manner that's very detailed. So we've been working with the National Institutes of Standards and Technology to thin section these mortars. And in some, what we found is Dr. Paul Stutzman at NIST told us when he started looking at our plasters that this was some of the most elegant pozzolanic bonding or plaster work that he'd seen since since he studied Roman materials. And the interesting thing is that our masons came straight out of the guild systems in London, so they're at the top of their game by the time they come over here. And so it's not something austere. Industrialization that happens later in the town and the implementation of enslaved labor doesn't always mean better or more elegant craftsmanship. In fact, it is in some ways is a little bit, maybe a little bit more austere, I would say. So once we find all of these things, of course, we always envision the past. We have a digital history team here, and we reconstructed the model, which was very frustrating for them because the more we dug, the more we would understand and change the model. And it is a very dynamic process. We would meet every couple of weeks and say, no, now we know this is the case. But we concurrently did that as the excavations went along. So the second part, and I'll go back to the slide, was the burials, and you can see them in the eastern end there. And so after this slide here, I will be showing human remains, but we have dealt with human remains for the last 26 years. James Fort has the largest parish church in our area for a number of years. People are being buried throughout up into the 18th century there. Humans, the way that we look at human remains is that we have one of the only collections where English, first Africans, first peoples are all coming together and adapting and changing in this new world environment. So oftentimes people forget that John Rolfe married Pocahontas and they had Thomas Rolfe, and Thomas later would live in the colonies. But that's essentially what we've got, is the Genesis story for the story that is us today. And I say that all the time, and people challenge me about that on occasion, visitors, and I'll say, well, pick a country and I can tell you what artifacts that we have from there, or individuals that we have. And I think Iceland may be the only country we don't have, although a gentleman from Oxford said that we may have a connection there with some of the animals. But it's very interesting. And again, I will show you how we take these cold cases, these 400-year-old cold cases, and bring information back to life. It's not always easy. I showed you that slide there was articulated remains. Most of the time, we're encountering our disarticulated remains, like in the slide pieces. This is the Smithsonian, Dr. Doug Owsley, his team, and my team in the church. And the reason that that's the case is that our notions of death and burial today were not shared by the English back then, and they weren't shared. They still aren't shared by the English. I've visited cemeteries in England where they're digging through other burials to bury somebody in a modern sense, and so human remains get discombobulated often, and it's just the case. It's the rule than the exception. Every burial ground we've worked on from 1607 all the way up to 18th century seems to be the case. Oftentimes graves disappear. The use of gravestones is a very sort of modern thing where everybody gets a stone. Back then it was sort of ashes to ashes, and so people would forget that people were buried there. So in this slide, what I wanted to show you is a couple things. There's over 20 graves in this less than 15 by 15 foot area. Those are the numbers we could sort of put on it. But another thing is, look at the material that's in the burial shaft. So again, we're forensic anthropologists when we're out there. And if you have a timber frame church that's just timber and clay, and then you have a brick building in 39, and then another brick building that's enclosing it with different mortars, if those are showing up in the graves, then axiomatically those graves came after that time period, right after the time when those materials are found. I hope that makes sense. And that's how we tell time. And sometimes, like you see these burials, they're cutting each other, and the fill from earlier graves will get into the later graves, et cetera, et cetera. But that's generally how we're able to get a rough estimate based on what we're finding. Now, carbon dating doesn't work for burials because it's basically a plus or minus 20-year time span, so about 40 years. And we're working within a few years. Like, we know that these graves here came after 39, but we're probably before 47 kind of deal. So anyways, I want you guys to see that. The grave to the very bottom of the slide where the wall goes across is one that we encountered. Now, a lot of these graves don't look like they were excavated, but at the turn of the century, the archaeologists dug into them sideways, which is a big no-no. Archaeology is like cake. The frosting on the outside is the youngest and the plate is the oldest. And we try to go in the order in which things were put down because that's how you tell time. So digging sideways is a big no-no. And so we removed all these that had some exposure. And when we're working, I refer to us as dirt surgeons. And when we're working, we're very careful in the process. It's a very sensitive time, and you can see that these burials had been impacted at the base, at the foot of the grave. The person on the right, the person on the left has bricks in them, and so much earlier. But oftentimes, how we tell time again is it can be the shape of the coffin. Coffin shapes change over time. Here you see bricks, but the gentleman on the left, I think it's my left in the slide talk, but the person with the brush, the skeleton near by him, the human remains there, actually contained an artifact. And this artifact was quite contentious with the team because it was a leading staff. And some of the team believed it would be much earlier, but part of our jobs is finding out what it is. And our curatorial staff found this portrait of this gentleman in England, unnamed portrait. And you can see in the painting, he's holding a nearly exact example of our what's called a captain's leading staff. And so often the captain of what was called a trained band, so they would be a trained band of individuals, would carry these leading staffs. Now, the problem with that is that, of course, we carry with us and we have artifacts from much earlier in time and then forward. However, this artifact, along with the remains of the multiple churches over time, give us a better understanding. And our supposition is that they date to the later 30s and 40s. So it's an ongoing pursuit. We have theories, we test them, and then we keep retesting them and working with the artifacts. Now, there was one grave, and this is a shot from over top that we became very interested in. One of the graves to the east cut into it, but in looking at it, it was very wide. It was wider than any of the other graves, and somebody had taken something off of the top and replaced that with herringbone brick. The soil layers underneath whatever had been there had slumped in and had accumulated different portions of the churches over time. But then it had been sealed off at some point. Now, this is a picture of the excavations in 1901, and the blue arrow is pointing to a gravestone that was, I'm going to move my picture here, but the gravestone, it's the oldest tombstone in English North America. It is a Belgian black limestone. We've tested the fossils in it. It would have had brass inlays, and I think you guys can see well enough. There's a rectangle here, these little holes. The holes in it are where they put lead so they could attach brass hold downs, but the individual is a knight and he is standing on a parquet floor. And so you can see these examples are from England. These are called monumental brasses, and they're inlaid in stone, and they're often stolen. So in England, it's very rare to find them because in the English Civil War, they ripped them up and melted them down for gun parts and things like that. But it's very clear that ours is of this type and this design. And remember, time, space, and form. These types with the knight, the parquet floor, that's a family crest and a Latin saying coming off to the side. This type dates from 1620 to 1640. Now, when we dug down into this burial, there was no, like I said, there was no plaster, no brick or mortar. And we got very excited because we knew the limits of the church. We knew that this person was in the very center of the chancel, the most holiest part of the church, much in the center. But he also had nobody buried around him subsequently. There was nobody buried near him. There were people all over the place, but nobody was buried in his contemporary. And so we started thinking that this person was of exceptionally high status. And so I'm a graduate of Leicester University in England, the team that found the king in the car park. Dr. Turi King did the genomics on Richard III, the king that was found there, and she was a friend of mine. We became friends and colleagues. And so I rang her up and said, what should we do to make sure that we are able to identify this individual potentially? And she said, oh, you absolutely need to take a belt and braces approach. And we looked at each other on the Skype call and said, what the heck is she talking about? And what that means in England, belt and braces means don't let your pants fall down. Braces are suspenders. And what she was saying is that you don't let anybody question your work. And so we began a process of building on to Leicester's work with using PPE. This is back, we excavated this in July of 2018. But as dirt surgeons, we want to know our patient. We want to know which direction the individual is facing. And the reason for that is when we start to excavate, we start with the feet first. There's so many bones in the feet. They're so delicate that we get over that and through that and away from it, and we move towards the cranium side. The cranium's the other very delicate part, but it is essentially, besides the mandible, it's one sort of unit, and it actually can go pretty quickly. You have to be very delicate, but you can just sort of remove the dirt if it's intact. And so the way that we've approached graves in the past is to excavate across the long bones, the tibias or the femurs, and we usually guess which end of the grave we're on, and we'll dig a narrow trench and expose the remains before we go to town. Well, Turi was saying, don't do that. You may contaminate the remains. So remember the radar that was used. So this is a picture of the burial. This is Mariana Richardson, my senior staff archaeologist, kneeling in front of it. And you can see how there is nothing in the grave shafts. It's just the clay. And then the central rectangle is where the remains fell in. The coffin collapsed and the upper layers sort of fell in to that cavity. And so at this point, we knew that this was serious. We knew we wanted to do something. And you can see how wide it is. It's exceptionally wide. It's actually, to sort of ruin the story, it's as exactly wide as the stone. But that's just one part of evidence, right? So here's ground penetrating radar in the field. Now this was a couple of years before, and this is out in Jamestown, and the gentleman pushing the machine volunteered. He was with the company that makes the equipment. And while eating lunch under the trees, he said to me, "Hey, Dave, if you're ever 4 or 6 inches from a skeleton, I think we can use radio waves, high frequency radio waves, to define a skeleton. And so if you tell me something like that, I'm going to call you up." So I called him, and his company was overjoyed to think that this might be the case. His boss said, "It's not going to happen. They bet a beer on it." And Peter Leach jumped down in the hole. This is a high frequency 2700 megahertz. And the deal with radar is the lower the frequency, the deeper you can get, but the less resolution. The higher frequency, the less penetration you can get, but higher frequency. And so it worked. So this is a skeleton. If you guys can't see it, we were able to image. It's the first time a skeleton had been imaged in the history of archaeology or even radar science. There's portions missing, and I'll talk a little bit about that, but we were very excited, and I'm going to show you what it ended up looking at. This is a time, or sort of a fade in. So pretty phenomenal to be able to, or at least I think so, to be able to look into the ground without even touching remains. That has some implications for my field, certainly. But again, very, very much a success. Now, there are a couple of things that are interesting about this individual. Firstly, and if you had a keen eye, you would have seen that the early slide that I showed that was just a graphic, his head is in the east. Most people in a Protestant church are buried with their head in the west, and this is a common Christian practice at the time of Jamestown. And the reasoning is in the Bible. It actually says that in the second coming of Christ, the parishioners will rise up and face the lightning of Christ that will come from Jerusalem. And so almost everyone we've ever dug, except for 3 people, have their head in the west. Now, to have this person's head in the east, why would that be? Because it also defines leaders and clergy as having their head in the east. So when the lightning of Christ comes, they will rise up and lead the congregation. They will face the congregation and lead it. So we have found Reverend Hunt, Gabriel Archer, and now this individual with their head in the west. So very interesting. Now, I wanted to show you guys what radar looks like. The image to the top there looks like a bunch of dead zebras is actually the radio waves. It's almost like a fish finder, if you've ever seen a fish finder. The image at the top is what we see, and then we use a computer program to, quote, migrate it down to individual points. The images on the right-hand side of the screen, or left for you maybe, is a digital pixel map. It's a pixel map depth map using DSLR. So your camera is actually recording time and depth with each pixel, and so we post-process that and map. So this is not an image, it's actually a 3D model using cameras. And the really neat part about this, which I love, the forensics about this, is the elevation model, which is the colored model there at the top. You see there's some forensic things going on. His hands are down at his hips. We never see that. We've only seen that maybe once with Captain Gosnold. This individual is laid out in state. He's laid out in the center of the church, and people are passing through him. Most of the time, people are bound. Their hands are bound at their waistline, their hips, and their knees are together and their feet are bound together. This individual has been wrapped in a burial shroud. His feet and knees are together, but his hands are down at the bottom of the coffin. Also, the green, sort of greenish high spot in the middle under his hip is real. And so you can see in the elevation model at the bottom where we're showing the two bones, it does slope to the south quite a bit. And that caused the body to tip over and the left femur and tibia to eventually torque and roll out. And that is why that image was redacted in the radar, because your tibia is like a stealth fighter. It's triangular in shape. And you would think that the radar waves would bounce off the flat spot, but they weren't. They were getting scattered. And so that's why some of the portions of that skeleton. Interesting if you're into physics. I told you guys we're geeks at the beginning of the talk, and that's we think some of this stuff is amazing. So in July of 2018, we decided to excavate. It's the only time that we could get the Smithsonian on site, the FBI, and Dr. Turi King over here and all be at the site at the same time. So on a Saturday, we began excavating. We put on our dirt surgeon suit. We built and constructed a facility that would push air in and not out. And we began excavating. We would subsequently work 17-hour days, two 17-hour days, as the Smithsonian would arrive on on Sunday, Monday, and then they would do their work on Monday and Tuesday, and then we had to have samples to the FBI lab at Quantico with Turi. Turi worked with their agents to extract DNA out of the remains, and then she took a sample to the Max Planck lab in Germany, and the FBI concurrently did a sample, and they turned out exactly the same, which is what you want to do with science. The reason that we wore suits and took all the time to do all this is to be belt and braced, of course. And I'm happy to say that there was zero contamination in any of the burial. Now we recovered all of this individual to date. We found his mandible in a grave to the south. The teeth that were in the grave fit in the mandible and cranium. So the head was missing. And I think that was in the news, but the grave to the south, which is here, cut into that individual's grave, and the gravedigger very gently put this individual's cranium and mandible in that, and we would match them up using teeth. Your teeth do not fit in someone else's head, by the way, and so we would put them in there in micro CT to make sure that was the case. Now, the part that we're looking for in archaeology to get DNA, or most likely to get DNA, is the petraeus bone. It's the hardest bone in your body. It's right behind your ear, right here. And it's the only bone that accretes over time, meaning it builds up like a tree rings. The rest of the bones in your body remodel over time, and the petraeus is very hard, quartz-like. And so that what they do is gently drill into that space and recover DNA. We did recover 40 to 70% endogenous, meaning DNA from the individual. And That's phenomenal. We'd only had 1% in the past with all the work we've done. So we're not sure if that's belt and braced or the multiple churches over time. So recently I was just up a week before last at labs in Allentown, Pennsylvania, doing micro CT work on the mandible and an individual's fibula, which I'll show you in a second. There was a supposition that he had a rotten tooth that might have killed him, and the technician is pointing here to calcification under the second molar there. The individual, the roots, the apical ends of the root, the ends of this individual's roots had also been resorbed. So the body had taken care of this infection and walled it off. So that wasn't the cause of death. We do know that the individual had osteomyelitis, which is a bone infection. And in fact, in the foreground, you can see the fibula, which should be about the size of my pinky, is swollen up there. The break that you see, the crack there, is post-mortem. This is Dr. Doug Owsley and Dr. Jim Horn, our president, we're actually filming at the Smithsonian, but we took that bone up recently and took a look at it. The individual is in some pain. This mandible here, the coronoid process, which are the pointy things sticking up off the mandible, should not be that big. And in fact, here's a picture of a normal, this is normal, and the X-ray or the CT on the upper portion is our gentleman. So I don't know if you can see my arrow, but this is the vestiges of the original coronoid process, and his is extended up. Now this comes from actually a couple things. Today, a lot of people who clench their teeth, either in anger or they're grinding their teeth at night, their TMJ, their muscles around their jaw will squeeze the coronoid process up into their temporal bone, and that actually makes it very hard to open your mouth. Now, in the case of our individual, he wasn't a night grinder. He's not grinding his teeth. So we think that damage, that bone infection, is causing him to clench his jaw in pain. And surgeons at University of Pennsylvania said this would have been a debilitating 24 hours of pain. We also are seeing Puryear's facets potentially, and arthritic lipping on the bone. That's something that we're working on right now. Now, how do we identify these people? You guys know 23andMe, very popular, Ancestry.com, all this stuff. That's kind of what we're doing, but we take it to a different level. This is the full sequence of the ancient DNA of our individual. It's nearly fully complete now, but the way we want to look into the past, and Turi gave me these slides to use, but she identified Richard III using these techniques, and Richard had no children. So how we do it is you can go back up the line, but what we're looking for is an unbroken male or female line. So in the case of Richard, they went down the Beaufort line, the male line, and it was broken. There was a paternity issue, right? So a child might not have their real father genomically. And so they ended up going down the female line and identifying him that way. And so that's what we're engaged in now. This was right before COVID, and libraries are still shut down in England, but I'm very hopeful because there's 26 potential female lines. And statistically, that's really good that we will find this person. Now, with any work that we do, obviously we do community engagement, and this is the Yardley family. We invited them out to the dig. We told them what we were going to be engaging in. They gave us their permission. And of course, they were overjoyed that we might identify their family member. Now, another thing that we do, because a lot of times we'll talk about isotopes and artifacts and things like that, but these are people. We do facial approximation, and that helps humanize, put you face to face. So these three people here are Jane, the young lady who was cannibalized here at Jamestown, Captain Bartholomew Gosnold, who I talked about, and Richard Mutton, a young boy who was slain by the Indians. And these are done by Studio Ice in Brooklyn. And the FBI graciously did a facial approximation of our gentleman. What they do is they go in and put tissue depths and clay on it, and this is what our individual, tentatively what our individual has looked like. So very exciting. The saga continues. We're digging outside the church. We recently finished excavations on the door to the new brick church. We think there was a portico there. And if you don't know what a portico is, here's a nearly exact example of our church in England. And this one's 1624. Our church is 1639. It often takes time for these styles to catch up. We also were excavated on the outside for the transition between the 1639 and 47 church. And this is something I'm engaging in modeling right now to understand how those churches existed at the same time. But you can see clearly here the different mortar types from brown and then gray over time. Currently, we're digging out in front of the tower. We're finding evidence of Bacon's Rebellion, fence posts that were around the tower. Here's the burning on the inside of the tower. Here's the burning on the outside. The artifacts are phenomenal. We're understanding the layers that went in to build the clay that went in to build up the walls, clarifying that history of the churches over time and being able to publish that. During COVID, I did publish my most recent book, Church and State, Foundations, Archaeology Foundations of Democracy. And that is a detailed forensic pursuit on the pages of everything that we talked about. I think it's available on our website online if anybody's interested. And lastly, in the last few minutes, I wanted you guys to know that all of this stuff, I'm just a storyteller. I am involved in these things, but I have the pleasure of telling the story of our pursuits to understand the past. And it's not just me, it's a team of folks. It's a team of younger folks that I've chosen as I have picked up the torch from our former director, Dr. William Kelso. And now I'm working towards passing that torch off to the next generation, because it's very important that this place be taken care of. So it takes a whole village of us to work on the site. And then, of course, I mentioned the FBI, the University of Leicester, Dr. Turi King, the Smithsonian. It's just a whole host of University of Pennsylvania, a whole host of people that are overwhelmed and overjoyed to work with us in our pursuits of information. The National Institutes of Science and Technology, they love us when we come in because they haven't seen some of these cases before. And so that is my story for today, and I'm sticking to it. The new information, the very exciting information, is that we found that evidence of Bacon's Rebellion a couple weeks ago. And we'll continue to test those theories that we have, keep digging, and then be able to come back and tell you guys what we found. So I'm going to end my screen sharing here. And I think that I have been told that we can take questions, which is very exciting. And you guys are welcome to ask me anything. I will try to answer it. Any questions you like.
Yeah, David, before we get started, we are going to have a Q&A session here. And before we get into that, I'm going to just tell our participants about our upcoming next couple of Encore Learning presentations. So on Monday, July 26th, we have a very interesting one on all the NASA projects, many of which you might have missed. I mean, obviously everyone knows about the moon missions and the shuttle space flights, but there's a lot more going on with NASA, including James Webb a telescope that's going to be launched, I think, next year to replace Hubble telescope and be able to show images from even further out in space. So please join us on July 26th for that. And then on August 9th, we have James Giordano, who I think many of you know because he's taught a number of our Encore Learning classes. And he will just talk about we'll love to have him talk about anything he wants to, but cutting edge of brain science. So you won't want to miss that either. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to pass the baton over to Madeline. She will, and don't forget, any questions you have, please submit them on through the Q&A function, and we're going to consolidate when necessary or just read them off to David so he can to answer them and continue this interesting presentation. So Madeline, go ahead.
All right, thanks, David. Both of the Davids today. have given us a great opportunity to learn much more about our history. David Givens, in your presentation, you mentioned several times Bacon's Rebellion. Would you give us a history of that, what it was, how it relates to Jamestown, please?
Sure. In September of 1676, a group of colonists rebelled against the government here and actually attacked the governor. And they went out and were trying to kill Virginia Indians because the colony was pushing out into the frontier, and they ended up getting chased down by soldiers from Jamestown, in which they came back to Jamestown and threatened to kill Governor Barkley. And it was led by Nathaniel Bacon. And he ended up being chased down into the swamps, the Dismal Swamp, and dying there. But they came into town on September 19th and burned the town. So they burned the church and other buildings, some of their own buildings. And that's known as Bacon's Rebellion. Some historians refer to that as our unruly teenager stage in American history, principally because 100 years later, we would have a revolution in a similar manner. But pretty important time period here at Jamestown.
Yeah. Look, reaching back into my own history, the name Nathaniel Bacon comes up in relationship to some other period. Was it a different Nathaniel Bacon?
Yes, yeah, there is other Bacons, certainly back in England and here. There's a building called Bacon's Castle, and they think only the troops just camped out in the yard. It's actually known as Arthur Allen's house. But once something gets called as Bacon's Castle, it's hard to get over those names. But yes, it's very, very common name down here.
All right, the next several questions have to do with the individuals themselves. Can you explain the connection to the Yardley family, and actually, do they have a name for the person as you saw at the end there?
A name for
the skeleton you thought you
oh
showed at the end.
Yeah, so the goal was to identify this individual, and we're our worst critics potentially, I would say, in terms of what we're going to announce. The FBI, given the onslaught of information that we have that this is Sir George Yardley, the presiding governor of the General Assembly. Yardley was known as an ancient planner. And the reason that they called them that was they were the people who either had survived the first few years or had been shipwrecked on Bermuda and then lived in that area. And so Yardley was known to have been in country in Virginia for quite a while, and the isotopes of the skeleton, meaning the stable isotopes that we recover from the bones, suggest that he was in Virginia for quite a while.
All right, and in general now, can you or your team ascertain the occupations or economic status of individuals once they are excavated?
Yes, that is an awesome follow-on question, because I realized halfway through explaining isotopes that that's an hour-long discussion itself. But yes, we study isotopes, stable isotopes that are within bones. Carbon, nitrogen, lead, and oxygen are generally what we focus on. New World grasses and grains have an extra carbon atom on the chain, so they're C4 rich, and Old World grasses and grains like wheat and barley are C3 rich. And so English people are strictly C3, essentially, and Virginia Indians are strictly C4. But there's a spectrum there once people start living in the New World and consuming grasses and grains like maize, right? The animals are also, when they're eating grass over here, they become C4 rich. And so we end up getting a timeline from isotopes, which is really interesting, because remember, I said the only bone that doesn't remodel is your petrius. All the bones in your body, your entire life until you die, remodel. And I think people don't know that. but your ribs are the quickest and your femurs are the slowest. Your teeth are locked in. Once you're about 15 and the enamel, your third molars, your wisdom teeth pop out.
Yes.
There's no more growth on your teeth. Your enamel doesn't keep growing like a horse. So you end up with fantastic data sets that might span an entire lifetime. A person's life tells us where they're born and living, from meteoric water all the way up to today. Now, status comes from lead or nitrogen. People who eat really good cuts of meat and are getting a lot of good nutrients, meat, they have high nitrogen. If they are drinking out of a pewter flagon or eating off of pewter plates or eating with a pewter spoon, which all our high status folks were engaging in, then you're going to get high lead. So if you're high nitrogen, high lead, you're like Yardley, you're like other, William West, all these high-end people that were here, Gosnold. But we do have cases like Jane. So Jane's isotopic signature was low lead, high nitrogen. So just the isotopes define her as a servant. She's cooking for her mistress and master, but eating with her fingers out of a wooden bowl. And so they tell us a lot. The last thing we look at is meteoric water, oxygen 18, and that tells us where you're from in a particular place. In England, it's concentric circles starting from the outer coastal areas into the center near London. And so we do know a lot more about this individual than I've been able to talk about today, because it's just overwhelming. It's an incredibly rich case. This gentleman, so we test the dirt inside the body. So your what you've eaten then decays and is in the dirt, and that's pollen and phytoliths, silicate parts of plants. And this individual had been eating New World like squash, and so the supposition that he could be somebody new from England, somebody high status who just got over here, it can't be. So hope that helps.
And is it too soon to ascertain any evidence about the American caste system?
The caste system?
Yes.
No, I mean, I think we found that all along to be the case. We have a very sort of regimented, I don't know if I would refer to it as a caste system, although that probably is appropriate. But you have people like Jane who are servants. You have the butchers, the bakers, and during the starving time winter, 69 and 10, they're the first to die. They're not getting those good cuts of meats and things like that. And when you get your, the irony is when the people who actually do stop die, then you get the starving time and you get a very tough time. And so, yeah, I mean, it's extremely stratified. Society is extremely stratified here. And that extends, we talk a lot about that with the first Africans are listed just above animals on then a lot of them don't even have names in the musters in the colonial records. And so, yes, that's something, I guess, a caste system you could refer to as that. I like that.
Please explain the involvement with the FBI in as much as we associate that with a crime.
Well, we have a 400-year-old crime scene, if you will, and they love us because our cases are hard cases, especially genomics. Some of the people we excavate they just don't look very good, like the individual I showed today. So they want to work on hard cases. Now, I met the FBI years ago. A student of mine went to work at Quantico, and the agent who interviewed me was very gruff and put on airs of being very gruff. And then I said, "Do you know what we do here?" And then I took him into our collections, and he about fell out of his suit there. And he said, "Look, if there's anything we can ever help you with, you call us, because you guys are amazing." And so over the years I've called. It first started with a slate writing tablet we found in John Smith's well that's got writing on it. The second thing I called was a silver reliquary, a Catholic reliquary that was found on top of a coffin, Gabriel Archer's coffin, something that is very contentious, if you will, in a Protestant colony. And then most recently on this case, we called them up and they were overjoyed to be run backup DNA with Turi and be the lab where we extracted the remains. And so it's synergistic. Obviously, you guys saw some really nice GPR. We've been talking to them, said, why don't you use GPR? And they said, well, it doesn't work. And I said, well, you need to see this PowerPoint. And so they now have a GPR intern coming to work with them. And I still work with them on a lot of other things. It's just great, right? Like our site is a crime scene. It really is. And if you think about it like that, and that we're trying to piece together some disparate information over the long term, it's very synergistic. Yep. Sorry.
Would you mind following up any further info about Jane? You mentioned she was cannibalized.
Yeah, that is a lecture that you signed me up for another encore lecture. Let's see, Jane was a young English woman. We used isotopes to determine that she was English and where she was from. She's from the South Coastal Plain. The forensics were phenomenal. I'm trying to pull out the Jane book. I just got our third reprint of a book I put together. Well, I won't mess with it. But anyways, Jane, the forensics on Jane and the work that was done is absolutely phenomenal with the Smithsonian. Jane died during the starving time and was, to quote the Smithsonian, processed to be eaten. And Jane is the confluence of everything I talked about today: history, archaeology, science, forensics, and then facial approximation, in which we could honor this young woman who lost her life here, and to show the power of everything that we've talked about today. And especially at the beginning of the talk, why does archaeology matter? I was at Oxford one time at the Center for Advanced Computing, and this historian stood up and said, who cares about archaeology? Everything we need to know is in the history books. And I think you guys can understand today why archaeology matters. You know, it's not history. And I very intentionally talk about that at the beginning. And a lot of people get upset. I had a woman in Charlottesville at the Jefferson School. She said, oh, so you hate historians? And I said, that's not what I said. It's two different ways of getting to the past, and they have to be reconciled. They have to be reconciled. So Jane was absolutely one of the high-end profiles. 600 million people saw that press release at the Smithsonian.
And following up on the dig again, have you found any evidence of remains of African slaves in Jamestown?
We have. It's so that's again another talk. I spent 3 years with the team digging down at the site of one of the first Africans, a woman named Angela. She was forcibly brought to the New World from Angola. She was on her way to Mexico, and English pirates stole her and her compatriots and brought them here. She lived with a gentleman about a third of a mile away from James Fortin in the town, and we got a Civil Rights Initiative grant in 2016 to dig that site for 3 years, which was phenomenal, because at the same time we dug the first representative government, and they arrived 2 weeks after that first representative government. And so to excavate on a site that has that much gravity for our nation is phenomenal. It's an honor, and you can see what archaeology does to the past. It brings it alive, firstly. Secondly, African-American history at Jamestown has had nothing. There are no pictures. There's nothing in the history books. And what we learned in those 3 years elevated to the point where I would wake up drinking my coffee, and there's Spike Lee, the film director, with a 1619 hat talking about the archaeologists at Jamestown, which is us. And to have that kind of recognition worldwide for a fifth of our nation in a founding narrative, that's pretty amazing. That's pretty amazing.
David, would you share the name of your book regarding this subject?
Yes, it's Church and State.
Yeah, no, the one on the African Americans. I think you mentioned that.
Oh, yeah, I'm writing that right now. In fact, I should be at home working on that. It's going to be just like this. And the idea is to just talk about it like we did today. Nothing we ever talk about, I want you guys to understand, is pandering. We're not George Bush's secretary, when George W. Bush, when she came out, she referred to us archaeologists as liberal types. I said, wait a minute, you don't know me. The archaeology and the things I'm talking about and dealing with, they're the empirical, they're real. How we interpret them is up to us. And history is malleable, it changes over time and things like that. And anyways, that book will be called, of course, Angela and the First Africans, probably 16, 19, 20, 19. And we'll discuss the archaeology. And it's not just about, First Africans as a story today, right? Look how many things we're talking about. Out there at the site, we found evidence of one of the first Armenian Americans who arrived in the colony in 1617. Isn't that amazing? And we didn't know about it till we found it. And we were like, what we found was a Ottoman Empire pipe, a smoking pipe from the Ottoman Empire. And we were like, what the heck is that doing out here? Well, there's a couple options, but my favorite is potentially this guy named George Martin. And in the colonial records, in parentheses, it says ye Armenian. And Armenia is a Christian sect within Iran, and the Iranian community know all about this guy, trust me. But that's one of the phenomenal finds that you just didn't know about, and is exciting when you find it.
And growing up in Blacksburg, how did you get interested in archaeology?
I lived on a farm there in the town. It's still there. My mom lives there still. But I was on my way to the bus stop, waiting for the bus. I found a arrowhead, what's called an arrowhead, a spear point made of quartz. It stuck out like a sore thumb because it's white, big, bright white thing. And I took it into school that day, and I went to my history teacher, Miss Grapsis, and I said, "Where did this come from?" And she said, "I don't know." And I said, "Well, where did the people go?" And she said, "I don't know." And I said, "Well, how come we don't know?" And she said, "Look, kid, there's these archaeologists that meet at the public library. Why don't you go talk to them and maybe they'll answer your questions?" And so that was a volunteer. The Archaeology Society of Virginia has chapters, and it's a volunteer group, and they go out on weekends. And so I was 14 and I started, volunteering, and then I went to college, and I wasn't necessarily studying archaeology, but I kept going to the archaeology lab and volunteering, and eventually, thought, why fight it? Why fight your, joy in life? Archaeology, we for years we lived below the poverty line, but you're happy, right? You're pursuing history. You're answering that question that I can't get over, which is why. How come we didn't know about First Africans? How come you've never heard of Angela, right? That's the problem. Why don't we know? We in January of 2019, we found a deposition by a sailor that explained everything about how the Africans came into the colonies. And so that's how I became an archaeologist. That's how I got into it. And I continue to live that way.
All right, the whole original site of Jamestown was once believed to have been washed into the river. Moving forward today, are we concerned with sea level due to climate change? And how are you dealing with the approach of the river?
Well, so the only riverside right now, the river that bothers us is hurricanes. So water comes up over our seawall that's out there and into the field and just absolutely trashes the area. That's only in an event like a hurricane or sometimes a nor'easter. The real problem as of late is, and you guys may experience this yourselves, we get 4 inches of rain out of one storm that comes across the East Coast, 4 inches. And I don't remember that as a child. I really don't. I remember 1/4 of an inch. We'd get all excited on the farm, or a 1/2 inch. But we often will get these days 4 inches of rain. It doesn't stop raining. Usually this time of year is the dry season, unless we get a hurricane. But that constant onslaught of rain is flooding the property, and the systems that have been put in aren't meant to deal with that much fresh water on top of the ground, the meteoric water. And now what we're seeing is that's eroding the seawall from behind. And the only way that we saw that was through ground penetrating radar. We used the radar to look at the seawall to look for voids. You can see voids or gaps where it's eroding out using the radio waves because they accelerate through air quicker than concrete, of course, and it shows up in 3D very well, very, very well. So that's something that we were trained to do and got to use, and we're taking steps to mitigate that.
So we've established, based on the DNA chart you showed that the grave that you were referred to was this George Yardley, and that you just mentioned. Have you done any excavation at the Yardley home? And I believe it's pronounced Fleur-de-Lis 100.
Oh, Flowerdew? No,
Fleur-de-Lis.
Flowerdew. It's pronounced Flowerdew.
Okay.
Yeah, Yardley owned that property, and there are people buried there, but they were excavated by Jim Dietz, Dr. Jim Dietz, and throughout the 70s and 80s. Yeah, he wasn't buried there. He was buried at Jamestown. But that site, yes, was dealt with. It's on private property. Unfortunately, a lot of Virginia, famous Virginia sites are on private property.
And why are the skeleton remains not fossilized?
Well, fossilization is the accumulation of minerals, right, into bones, and ours haven't had that amount of time for that to happen. Or another way you can get that is conditions, the right conditions for mineralization. Yardley's bones were under a church for quite a while, and they were in great condition. It's usually not the case. If we're seeing good looking remains, it's because of something that's in the soil. Like Gosnold had oyster shells and copper salts above his grave in a pit, and those leached into his remains and preserved them. So yeah, I can't think of ever a case where we're dealing with fossils. It's usually just bones.
And going back to Bacon's Rebellion, at the end of the presentation, you mentioned evidence. Was that the fire?
Yes, yeah, the fire. They set the church on fire, and so we're doing more work to test that theory of what we found. But we will be making an announcement in the paper that we've found that.
And in the description of your talk that you provided us, you mentioned that the excavations sheds light on the division between church and state. Is the takeaway from this that there was little separation between the two?
Ooh, I like Carrie Jones. That's also, yes, that's what we're playing on. There was no separation between church and state. Government was held in the church, and that was just something that we were playing on. In fact, I've said to some of my colleagues that I'm one of the least religious people at Jamestown, and I have friends who are in the religious community here in town, and they think it's kind of interesting that I've two of my books, one's called Holy Ground and the other one's Church and State, and the staff helps name some of the titles or the pages, but one of my coworkers would always say that we're on our knees praying that we're going to find something, and we're exceptionally spiritual people, right? You have to be very strong in spirit to do what we do, and digging holes and then filling them back in. But yes, it's a play on the separation of church and state, which of course government, our founding fathers were moving to that, but our founding grandfathers were fully immersed in the church and government together.
Just to follow up about the water and the climate issue, I thought it'd be interesting if you described to the audience what happened this past Friday when you anticipated a potential hurricane and how you had to prepare the site.
Yeah, I had to apologize, guys, to the team. We did a run through last week, and we were getting Hurricane Elsa on Thursday, the remnants of Hurricane Elsa. And so what we use is landfill liner, plastic that's got fiber embedded between two layers. It's very thick. But what we do is we cover the site, the holes, the units, the squares that we're digging in, and we just let the water fill it in, and then we put in a grinder pump that's used for a sewer, for example, and then we just pump the water out and peel the plastic back. We've learned over the years not to fight the water, just embrace it. And in fact, on occasion, when we've got really bad hurricanes, we'll often fill the site with water in that plastic like a pool, because where there's water already there, the plastic stuff can't get in. That's something I learned from working with FEMA. So we do different things, but that's how we keep the site. And I had to apologize to the Encore team because we were running around like chickens with our heads cut off, trying to get things sandbagged, blocking the doors with sandbags, the door to the church so water couldn't come in, things like that. If it's really bad and we're going to get a hurricane, we cover all the books with plastic. We take our computers and put them into what we call the vault. It's a room with bulletproof windows, and then we sometimes we get some of the stuff off island, like the notes or something like that. We're very careful, but it's a lot of work, and you can imagine in some of these years we get one hurricane after another. It gets a little old, but we're still here.
Well, we're appreciative of the work all of you do. And I think I have two more questions. We're right at 4:30, David. What was the cause of the starving? Was it the food? Was it the trade?
That's a great question. It's complicated because at the time of James Fort, we were in one of the worst droughts in 770 years. So food was a little scarce. The colonists were told to get food from the Virginia Indians and not let the native population know they were here to stay. So no gardening. They didn't want them to garden, even though they did. They had to. And then in 1608, John Smith writes a letter to the Virginia Company, and he says, I'm paraphrasing, but it's pretty much this is the case. He says, "I don't mean to be rude, but stop sending us people that don't do stuff." And so the company takes that seriously, and they decide to send over a whole flotilla of ships and 300 people, supplies, and leadership, new leadership. So there's one of the boats is brand new, the Sea Venture, and the other 8 are older, but the other 8 have 150 people on them. The Sea Venture is so large it has 150. The Sea Venture gets caught in a hurricane in June of 1609 and gets shipwrecked on Bermuda and would not arrive till the following spring of 1610. So the other 150 people make it here and swamp the colony with hungry mouths when there's already trouble. Another thing is that in the fall, well, the late summer, fall, John Smith gets a powder burn and has to go back to England. And he's the ambassador to Powhatan, or the Virginia Indians here, Wahunka. And it was Powhatan, and when he goes back, they lose their ambassador, and they resort to violence with the Virginia Indians, which then starts the Anglo-Powhatan War, which means they're sequestered in their fort. They do not have any fishing nets, they don't have poles, and they said if they stirred outside the bounds of their fort, they would be cut down by the Indians. And so that's how the starving time winter. Those are the things that essentially the causes of it. It's very complicated, but it's the one thing everybody remembers: cannibalism in the starving time.
All right, focusing on today. Are there volunteer opportunities available? If so, describe the kind and skill of person that would be successful at this type of work.
Well, our volunteers corps is larger than the archaeology team. They mostly Williamsburg's a retiree community because it's very temperate down here. It might snow just a little bit every once in a while, so you can remember what it looks like. But you often, December, it's 70, 80 degrees out, you know, you go play golf. So our retirees are very, they've come about life. They've worked for NASA on the space program. There's all kinds of different paths in life. But they enjoy history and what we're doing, and they interpret on site here. They're the ones standing next to us with material like the books and explaining what it is we're finding. So that's how we engage with the volunteer corps. And if anybody would like to volunteer, I think Madeline and some of the other folks have my email, and just reach out and I can pass it on to our volunteer coordinator.
All right.
Yeah.
We'll find a way to make sure people have that. And certainly we hope that everyone has an interest in history would think about this, because we all understand the importance of your work.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. And thanks to you and your team and all the work that you have done. And obviously thanks for helping us understand a little bit about our past and how we can relate this to the present.
Okay. Thanks a lot. Everybody
You're
be
welcome.
well. Yep. And we'll talk to you soon. I hope to be back.
Thank you everyone for participating. This concludes our special event for today.